Let's move on now to a discussion of the middle colonies. We've already covered the New England or northern colonies, and so proceeding by region, we come now to the middle colonies, by which we mean New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Maryland and Delaware are often put into this category. The middle colonies, as we should suspect, are being in the middle, are a mix of a lot of the political, religious, and economic cultures of the North and the South. So we definitely see a lot more heterogeneity in the middle here, a lot of variety, and we can see that with the formation of the colony of Maryland, founded in 1632. Maryland was created along what will become known as the Chesapeake Bay, and has a very unique founding as the exclusive Catholic colony in the New World. It was founded by George Calvert, who was the first Baron of Baltimore. Once again, the king owed him a great debt, and instead of paying him simply in money, gives him a grant of land in the New World. Calvert was particularly interested in founding a colony in the New World because by the 1630s, Roman Catholics have been more or less excluded from political life in England with the triumph and the establishment of the Anglican Church under Queen Elizabeth. So by the time of King Charles I, Catholics are looked upon with great suspicion and derision in England, particularly after the 1605 Gunpowder Plot. And so seeking a place of religious refuge for his religious group, George Calvert founds the colony of Maryland as a safe haven for Catholics in the New World. Maryland is a colony also based on the cash crop of tobacco, and which is also heavily dependent on African slaves in the formation of these large plantations. Maryland, as a Catholic colony, was particularly interested in protecting religious rights. And therefore, from Maryland, the most important contribution that we have from colonial Maryland is the first example of a Religion Toleration Act in the New World. This is the Maryland Toleration Act of 1649 that promised religious freedom for all groups except Muslims, Jews, and atheists. Therefore, Roman Catholics, unlike most other colonies in the New World, would have a safe haven here to practice their religion as they see fit. Of course, the Maryland Toleration Act is a forerunner of what will eventually be enshrined in the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, which is the freedom of religion. Thereafter, Maryland is predominantly a Catholic colony. The Roman Catholic leadership of the colony was concerned that eventually many more Protestants would move into the colony and eventually take over leadership of the colony and exclude Roman Catholics. That does not happen, but that was originally the inspiration for passing the Maryland Toleration Act. The capital of the colony of Maryland is Baltimore, named after Cecil Calvert, the second Baron of Baltimore, and it becomes obviously an important port city in colonial America. Colonial Maryland is also well known for its northern border. There were two surveyors named Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon who in the 1760s are going to survey the northern border of the colony with its neighbor to the north. They establish this surveyed line, and named after the surveyors, it becomes nicknamed the MasonDixon Line. The Mason-Dixon line is going to become a useful shorthand expression for the dividing line between the North and the South. Many people will use the designation of the Mason-Dixon line as a shorthand expression, particularly in the 1800s leading up to the American Civil War, as the dividing line between the North and the South, or the dividing line between slavery and freedom. That is because Pennsylvania will become a free state and Maryland will be a slave state. Now, it's an imperfect designation because even though it does, on one hand, mark something of a line between freedom and slavery, Maryland will not secede from the Union at the time of the Civil War. It will remain a slave state even though it is part of the North, part of the Union. But nevertheless, this is where we have the origin of the Mason-Dixon line and this expression as a dividing line between the North and the South. In 1664, the colony of New York is established. But before we can talk about the colony of New York, which was an English colony, we need to talk about the colony that was there before, which was a Dutch colony, which was New Netherland, founded by the Dutch Republic in 1614 and is going to last until 1674. The Dutch are very interested in establishing colonies in the New World as well. They have a growing overseas empire and a very strong merchant fleet. And so the colony of New Netherland is established with its capital city of New Amsterdam. So the Dutch influence in the subsequent history of New York is, of course, very prominent. A lot of the mascots of teams that will be created in New York pay homage or a nod to the Dutch heritage. There's going to be a very strong Dutch Reformed Church in New York and a very strong Dutch presence and influence of Dutch culture in the development of New York Colony and New York State for years to come. A very pivotal event in the early history of the colony is when the Dutchman Peter Minuit purchases the island of Manhattan from the Lenape Indians for 60 Dutch guilders and a few beads. That is probably one of the greatest real estate purchases in all of world history. That is the equivalent to roughly about $1,000 in contemporary money. The island of Manhattan becomes the capital city of the colony of New Netherland, and which is called New Amsterdam as of 1664. It's just on the tip of the island of Manhattan. And of course, those essentially $22 in beads that Peter Minuit uses to purchase the island of Manhattan, needless to say, is today some of the most expensive and most valuable real estate in the world. That is an overhead shot of the portion of the lower end of Manhattan today, which of course is the center of international finance and commerce today. Very important governor of the Dutch colony of New Netherland is PeterStuyvesant. PeterStuyvesant is very concerned about the encroaching presence, the surrounding influence of English colonies around his Dutch colony. And so on the tip of the island of Manhattan, he constructs a wall as a piece of fortification to defend the Dutch settlers who are mostly located on the tip of the island of Manhattan. There is a street that is connected to that wall, and this is, of course, the origin of one of the most famous streets in the world, Wall Street. So Wall Street is so named because there was a wall or a fence, a fortification, to keep particularly the English and perhaps Indians out from the northern end of the island. And later on, this will become a place, a market, a place where traders would gather and purchase stocks in each other's businesses. And then, of course, it will develop into the center of international finance today, known as Wall Street. So, in one of the many wars that the English fight in the 17th century and distract them from paying attention to their Northern American colonies because they're at war in Europe, one of those wars, they are at war with the Dutch Republic. And so part of that war, the Duke of York sends some gunboats up the Hudson River and secures control of not only New Amsterdam, but also interior possessions further up the Hudson River. And so as a result, the English seize control of the colony of New Netherland. Here is PeterStuyvesant surrendering the colony to the English fleet in 1664. And thus we have the formation of the now English-controlled colony renamed New York. New Netherland becomes New York, and the city of New Amsterdam becomes New York City. And this, of course, is going to be one of the most prosperous and most significant colonies in colonial America. Most of the settlement for the colony of New York is on the island of Manhattan, some on what will become known as Long Island, and then settlements along the Hudson River all the way up to Albany. But as you can see, most of what we call the state of New York today is still occupied by a very powerful Indian confederacy, the most prominent tribe of which were the Iroquois, and therefore we call it the Iroquois Confederation. Very important trial takes place in Colonial New York in 1734. This is the trial of John Peter Zenger. Zenger was a printer in New York, and he wrote some very critical things of some leaders of the colony. And he is charged with slander and put on trial for these things. And his lawyer successfully acquits him, gets him declared not guilty of these charges, and exonerates him. And it establishes an important precedence in American jurisprudence, which is the principle of free speech and free press, that citizens have a right to criticize their leaders, and an important part of popular government is the ability to freely express oneself. This principle is eventually, of course, going to work itself into the First Amendment of the United States Constitution with the constitutional right of free speech. Also, in the colony of New York, we have the creation of a college for the training of Anglican ministers. Now, New York will be a royal colony, an Anglican colony, and therefore King's College is founded in 1754, which is later renamed Columbia University. Immediate to the south of New York is New Jersey. A few counties break away from New York and form the colony of New Jersey, which of course is also going to be important for its coastline and support for the rapidly growing city of New York City. You also have an important Anglican college in New Jersey, which is originally formed as Queen's College in 1766 and will later be renamed as Rutgers. Also in New Jersey, you have the College of New Jersey, founded in 1746, which later will be renamed Princeton University. This is the first university, the first college, the successor to William Tennant's Log Cabin College, that will train Presbyterian ministers. Presbyterians are not in large numbers in colonial America, but they do have a growing influence, and perhaps their influence is actually greater than their numbers. And the creation of the College of New Jersey and training additional Presbyterian ministers is really going to reinforce that Scottish presence in colonial America and lead to the formation of additional Presbyterian churches. A very large colony immediate to the west of New Jersey is, of course, Pennsylvania, founded in 1681. Pennsylvania is named after William Penn. William Penn's father also was owed a great debt by the King of England. And William Penn's father had supported the restoration of Charles II to the throne of England after the English Civil War and Oliver Cromwell's protectorate. And so, as a gesture of paying off that debt, Charles II also does not have the money to pay off William Penn, and therefore he gives a large tract of land as a grant to William Penn in the New World. William Penn, turns out, was actually quite interested in forming a colony in the New World because he, too, is part of a religious group that is widely persecuted and denied a lot of political participation in England, known as the Quakers. The Quakers were one of these religious dissenting radical groups that come out of the English Civil War, founded by George Fox, and rejected the authority of the sermon and reading of the scriptures in their gatherings, but rather they believed that when this Society of Friends, as they called themselves, came together in a Quaker meeting house, that they should sit and wait for the inner light to activate in their hearts. The inner light is something akin to the Spirit of God, and when it activates man, woman, or child, that man, woman, or child may stand up and start to speak a word. So the Quakers believe in direct, special revelation that comes directly to individuals from God. So this group is widely marginalized and excluded from the Anglican Church and being licensed in England. And so William Penn, as a member of this group, is proud to found a colony in the New World, which will be a safe haven for Quakers. And therefore, William Penn lands close to what we would call Penn's Landing today in Philadelphia. He too, like Roger Williams in Rhode Island, purchases land from the local Indians, which ensures peace and stability for the founding of this colony, and as a result creates his capital city for the colony, the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia. Philadelphia will go back and forth with Boston as the largest city in colonial America, and definitely one of the most important port cities, and very important politically. It is, of course, in Philadelphia that you have the construction of the Pennsylvania State House. This is the original State House for the colony of Pennsylvania. Later, this building will, of course, be the scene of the signing of the Declaration of Independence and also the drafting of the United States Constitution, and will be renamed Independence Hall. For most Europeans, if you asked a typical European, they probably couldn't name a single American during the colonial period. Certainly, the North American colonies were important and well known in the world, but Americans themselves aren't known. If there is an American that the typical European could name, it would probably be Pennsylvania's most famous son, Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was actually born in England and comes to colonial America, to Boston. When his parents die in Boston, he picks up and moves south to Pennsylvania and resides in Philadelphia. He becomes a printer and makes quite a bit of money and is quite successful as a printer in Philadelphia. His most famous publication that he himself writes and prints is Poor Richard's Almanac, which was a collection of witty sayings and wise sayings that he had heard and advice, popular advice for the 1730s. Franklin is an inventor, he's a printer, he's an entrepreneur, he's a businessman. He is the founder of the first fire department in colonial America. He's the founder of the first lending library in colonial America. He invents the Franklin stove. He also invents bifocals. He's also a scientist. He conducts his very famous experiment with a kite and a key, and demonstrates in the middle of a thunderstorm that lightning is electricity, which was previously unknown. It was thought to be some orbs of light or gas, but he indeed proves that it is electricity. He is also plays a role in the founding of probably the only secular college founded in colonial America, that is the University of Pennsylvania. Originally, some Presbyterians come together to found a seminary for training Presbyterian ministers, but is eventually founded as a secular college with the influence of Franklin in Pennsylvania, and so we have the University of Pennsylvania. We also have an event in Pennsylvania that seems to be a recurring theme in colonial America. Frequently, settlers in the formation of colony would settle along the coast, next to the ocean, establish a port city. That's usually where the capital city would be for the colony, and only gradually would they move inland. Usually, rich landowners would control large plantations or large tracts of land along the coast, and so settlers who arrived later had to penetrate further into the interior, head west in the colony. Problem with doing so is, of course, all that land needs to be cleared, and you do so under the threat of often hostile native tribes on the interior. So these settlers who move west often feel disconnected from the political leadership of the colony along the coast in the capital city, and they also feel greatly threatened under the attack of Indians towards the west. And so what you see frequently is Western settlers marching in anger, almost in revolt, towards the capital city, demanding greater protection, greater representation perhaps a reduction in taxes, and greater involvement in the colony. You see that in Pennsylvania in 1764 with the Paxton Boys, who moved to the interior and demand greater representation. We're going to see this in other colonies as well. The middle colonies also include the colony of Delaware, founded in 1664. The second smallest colony after Rhode Island, right along Delaware Bay, very close to New Jersey. And Delaware, originally, this tract of land is settled. Some of its earliest settlers are from Sweden. These Swedes established Fort Christina. This is what is often done in the New World. The first structure you construct is a fort, and then gradually you move out with dwellings and set up fortifications to protect your dwelling. And what the Swedes do is introduce one of the most important pieces of architecture in American history, and that is the log cabin. The log cabin was a type of structure made out of the trunks of trees, popular in Sweden, and they introduced this to the New World. And so this iconic American example of architecture in the American dwelling of the log cabin is really introduced by the Swedes in the 1640s and 50s. Later, the English come to control the vast amount of land in Delaware, and it is under Thomas West, the third Baron of Delaware, that we get the namesake of the colony of Delaware, named after Delaware. The final region of colonial America that we need to consider are the southern colonies. By the southern colonies, we mean Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So we've already talked about the origins of the colony of Virginia with the founding of Jamestown in 1607. Settlers finally are able to secure a successful colony at Jamestown because of the cash crop of tobacco and also surviving the starving time. Finally generating enough food to be self-sustaining. They are reinforced with additional settlers from England. A group of women are brought over to Jamestown, which leads to several marriages and additional births in the new land, and then also subduing the local tribes and being able to start moving north, south, and west out of Jamestown and expanding the larger colony. So by Virginia earns its namesake from Queen Elizabeth I, famously known as the Virgin Queen, who never marries over the course of her reign. Virginia, perhaps, is the largest colony in colonial America. Like a lot of colonies along the coast, even though they have never sent explorers or surveyors to the west, they claim vast tracts of land, tens of thousands of acres in the interior, with Virginia claiming all the way up to what we would call Michigan and Wisconsin and the Ohio Valley. The actual colony of Virginia in the colonial period is what we would call the states of Virginia, West Virginia, and Kentucky. So it's a very large colony, even though it is, of course, very sparsely settled towards the interior. As an inducement to get Englishmen to move to the colony of Virginia, the London Company issues what are called headrights. A headright was a grant of land of various sizes that would be a free grant of land if you were willing to cross the Atlantic and come and settle in the colony and improve the land. So the amount of land varied tremendously. It could be 100 acres. It could be all the way up to 1,000 acres. But if you were willing to get your passage to come across the Atlantic, which could be a treacherous voyage, and make it to the New World and move to the interior and improve the land either by the construction of a mill or some type of press or farming the land, then the land would be yours. That's a very important precedent for subsequent American history, because later on during the settlement of the West, the American government is going to essentially do the same thing with the Homestead Act, which is going to be a grant of land that if you are willing to farm it for a number of years and improve it, then the land would be free. So if you think of the crowded cities of Europe and the lack of people who actually own their own land in Europe, this is an enormous incentive to come to the New World, risk its hazards, and enjoy prosperity. The other important policy that the London Company creates in order to encourage settlement is indentured servitude. For the poor, or the underemployed, or the unemployed in England, this program was a great incentive also to come to the New World and to start a new life. What would happen is an individual could go to a sea captain in England and sign a contract of indentured servitude, pledging themselves to work, usually for a period of about 3 years, gain free passage to the New World. Then the sea captain would often sell the contract to an employer or a master in the colony of Virginia, or particularly in the southern colonies. And then you would have to work for that master for usually a period of 3 years and work as a domestic servant, but usually as a field hand. And at the end of the 3 years, you've earned your freedom. You can leave scot-free and debt-free. Sometimes, to sweeten the deal on these indentured servant contracts, there may be a small parcel of land that is thrown in for a longer period of service. It was also possible that perhaps the master would pledge one of his daughters to a young man as his wife, that they could start a family and also farm the land that they had earned through their indentured servitude. So this becomes a very popular method for a lot of young Englishmen, particularly, to come to the New World. In the colony of Virginia, we have the first body of representative government in the New World. So you remember that the Spanish and the Portuguese, of course, established colonies and settled extensively in Central and South America and also in Spanish Florida. But the governor there is appointed usually by the monarch, and the magistrates are not popularly elected. But in Virginia, and with the coming of the English and the establishment of the English colonies, we have self-government for the first time in the New World. And in Virginia, with the creation of the House of Burgesses, this actually enables people to participate in government. A burgess was a wealthy landowner. They are the largest landowners in colonial Virginia. This is not the small yeoman farmer. This is not the young farmer that just completed his contract of indentured servitude. It's certainly not the African slave. This is the largest landowners that get to participate in this political body, essentially form a legislature for the colony of Virginia. They would come together to make decisions and work with the royally appointed governor, because the southern colonies are royal colonies, work together with the governor to make decisions regarding the colony. Now, there is some resentment for smaller landowners who are not able to participate in the House of Burgesses. The most famous example of that resentment probably occurs with Bacon's Rebellion. So Nathaniel Bacon was one of these settlers in the interior, one of the western portions of Virginia, constantly frustrated by being under attack by native tribes in the interior, and often feeling neglected, ignored, overlooked, and poorly supplied, poorly defended by the colonial leadership in Jamestown. And so in 1676, Nathaniel Bacon leads a rebellion, leads a march east in which they go all the way to Jamestown and actually burn Jamestown down and the building where the Burgesses met. Needless to say, this got the attention of the Burgesses, and they are forced to pay more attention to Western settlements in the future. The colony's capital subsequently moves to Colonial Williamsburg, and this will become one of the largest cities in colonial Virginia, and indeed the capital for quite some time. In Virginia, you also have the formation of a college to train Anglican ministers, and also aspiring young law students, which is the College of William and Mary. The colony of Carolina is founded in 1663, originally as a single colony. To understand the founding of the colony of Carolina, we need to look beyond the English colonies in North America down to a different English colony in the Caribbean. Probably one of the most profitable colonies for the English in the New World is the island of Barbados in the Caribbean. The reason why Barbados was so profitable was because it is a large sugar colony. There are large sugar cane plantations on the island of Barbados owned by the English. So if you think about the very bland diet that Europeans had to endure throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, there was great excitement in Europe when the spice trade from India introduces some spice to their food, particularly cinnamon. With the discovery of sugar, and sugar can be a rather fickle crop that requires the exact type of sand, not even soil so much, and the right humidity and the right hot temperatures to grow. It can't grow in Europe. And so discovering that it could grow on the island of Barbados and other Caribbean islands, this proves enormously profitable for the English Empire. And so the dream of a group of investors known as the Lord Proprietors was that they would invest in this new colony named Carolina, named after King Charles, that will be a sugar colony. Now, it turns out that the soil is not ideal for the growth of sugar in Carolina, so it doesn't take too long for the Lord Proprietors and their field hands and African slaves to move away from this endeavor and switch to two much more profitable products that are grown in Carolina, which are indigo and also rice. The largest and most significant city in Carolina is also the capital. This is Charleston, which also creates a very natural harbor and becomes one of the largest cities in colonial America, a very key port city, particularly for the South. In the colony of Carolina, we also have another one of these episodes, like the Paxton Boys in Pennsylvania and Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, of frontier settlers feeling very restless and undefended and therefore marching towards the coast and demanding recognition and greater political participation and greater defense against the Indians. This is known as the War of the Regulation, and an attack by the regulators from the West against East Coast government. In the colony of Carolina, we also have one of the more famous and colorful and mythical figures of colonial America. This is Edward Teach, better known as the pirate Blackbeard. Blackbeard was indeed a real pirate, a marauder, mercenary, who at times would work with the English and at times would work against the English. Apparently, he eventually offends or crosses too many of the English authorities in the colony of Carolina, and therefore he is hanged in 1718 in the harbor of Charleston. Eventually, the colony of Carolina proves too large and too unwieldy to really rule, and therefore it is separated into two colonies in 1729, which are, of course, North Carolina and South Carolina. The final colony that we need to mention in colonial America is the 13th colony, and also the colony formed and founded last in 1732, and this is the colony of Georgia, named after King George of the Hanover dynasty in England. Georgia is almost an afterthought for British imperial minds. Really, the purpose of the founding of Georgia is for two reasons. One, it is founded as a buffer state to protect the northern 12 English colonies against Spanish Florida, and it's also founded as a penal colony, a colony where to put prisoners and criminals. The key military leader for the founding of the colony of Georgia is James Oglethorpe, a very strict disciplinarian who oversees the construction of prisons and the settlement of the colony of Georgia, mostly along the coast. This is the most sparsely settled colony with the smallest population. He's a social reformer, and he's concerned about the worthy poor. Real problem for England in the 18th century is that there are very strict laws on the book that if you cannot pay your debts or if you declare bankruptcy, you could be sent to debtor's prison. Of course, being in debtor's prison, you're not able to work and pay off your debts, and so it leads to a vicious cycle. So therefore, English debtors were reassigned from prison to the colony, where if their crimes were not significant, they could actually work the land and see to the success of the colony, because they were granted small pieces of land. Originally, there are no large plantations in Georgia. Georgia has a very different purpose than Virginia and Carolinas to the north. Also, slavery is also prohibited in the colony. So it is created as a buffer state against the Spanish in the south. There's great fear that the Spanish from Florida will march north in the outbreak of another European war and move against the valuable English colony. So it's set up as a buffer state, a military outpost, but also as a penal colony. The largest settlement in colonial Georgia is Savannah. Savannah will also be the capital, founded in 1733.